Hi, everybody. I guess I'm excited that there's such a large attendance. I'm not sure I'm surprised. I think a lot of us are thinking about this quite a lot. And so it's maybe not surprising that this has generated the audience that it has. I spend a lot of time thinking about it because obviously AI has the potential to completely change the landscape of what VoiceMap does, what most of us do. And so I thought it was a good opportunity to say something about that and see if it resonated. I came up with the name Weirdly Human because when LLMs first appeared, I think everybody felt like they had passed the Turing test. So they had somehow kind of found the ability to respond to us in a way that felt human, that was weirdly reminiscent of the way that a human would talk. And of course, that has progressed quite rapidly in the last couple of years. So we're now in a place where we sort of are potentially looking at an existential risk to not just audio tours, but to a certain kind of storytelling. And I think that shapes how we look at telling stories and changes how we think about why we tell stories. I don't just want to talk in the abstract. I'm going to look at some of the science around what types of stories resonate with people, and I think there's a lot of hope in that. But I'm going to start grounding this in audio tours for obvious reasons by talking about how what AI can do in telling a story is, let me just switch over to this actually. Are we getting the right view there, Helene? Just let me double check.
See the agenda.
Yeah, but it's just the slide.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So let me, okay, so there we go. Okay, cool. So I think that AI in creating impersonal kind of encyclopedic content with professional but inauthentic voices actually does a lot of what audio tours have been doing for a very long time. And so there's always been an opportunity, and I'm going to point to that opportunity, but then I'm going to look at some of the science, particularly neuroscience, around personal storytelling and why that should be such a big focus for all of us. And then I'll take a look at what AI can do, what it's going to just keep getting better at, and then what it potentially can't do, at least in this incarnation of AI, which, I think all of us are mostly talking about LLMs, large language learning models, like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. And then I'm going to look through some practical steps broken down in the way that we break down the production process at VoiceMap. So how can AI help you map a tour? How can AI help you script a tour? How can it help you record the audio or produce the audio for a tour? And then, ending with the rallying cry of being weirdly human. So that's quite a lot to cover. I'll try and keep it as short as possible. I think the best thing is for me to allow for some questions as we go, rather than trying to stack them all at the end. I'm really interested in what everybody thinks and what everybody else has experienced here. So please, Helene is going to try and moderate questions in the chat and share those at intervals, but also I'll open things up periodically and we can have a chat. So there were two albums released in November last year. Both of them rose to the top of the charts. The one was a country music album produced entirely by AI, by a musician, a robot musician called Breaking Rust, who looks really good for a robot in a cowboy hat. And the other was by Rosalia, who I've been a fan of for a number of years. She started out as a flamenco artist, but has become a pop star of some significant popularity. The Breaking Rust album, like I say, completely AI generated, rose to the top of the streaming charts, I believe, for country music. And I think, if you are a country musician, that's pretty depressing. And if you go and you listen to it, it's terrifying how accomplished it sounds. Rosalia's album is in 13 languages, uses a hodgepodge of genres, but she's classically trained on top of the flamenco training, and so it uses a lot of classical music in a way that is totally unusual for pop, but also brings in Portuguese fado, brings in reggaeton, which her last album used a lot of reggaeton, brings in a lot of flamenco, and just kind of takes this global influence of stuff that interests her and brings in a lot of personal storytelling and creates this totally rich and unique experience that I think she charted at the top she was at the top of 4 different genre charts in the first week after releasing the album. So here you have kind of the case for AI art and the case for really human art. And there's a quote that I really love about how her album Lux comes across as a giant FU to AI-assisted music. In this AI everything era, Lux is a reminder that creativity comes from lived experience, human tension, breath, and body. The album's superpower is deeply, proudly, and unmistakably human. And I think that idea of art that is an FU to AI-assisted anything is something that a lot of us will feel quite strongly about. But as I said, I think that the problem and the reason why, coming back to audio tours, there's an opportunity for AI is because when I started VoiceMap, and we're talking about 2014, maybe 2015, I did this poll that said, what is the thing that you think of when you hear the phrase audio tour? And that's lost to time because Twitter is no longer Twitter, it's X, and you can't go all the way back through your Twitter archives anymore, so I can't find it. So I forget all the options, but the most popular option in that poll was a dusty museum. And when people heard the phrase audio tour, they thought of a push button device plugged into some really kind of battered headphones with the voice of a newsreader saying something that could be an encyclopedia, right? And I think that perception remains, right? Of course, if anybody's done a VoiceMap tour, they've had their conversion moment, their Damascus moment, and they realize that audio tours can be much more. But for most people, that's what an audio tour is, right? And so perhaps we shouldn't really be afraid of AI-produced audio tours because they're going to follow that pattern. They're going to do better than I think the average museum could do. And they put a lot of tools in front of people who are looking to create that kind of generic content, but it is still content in that mold. And from the beginning, I've tried to encourage us all to create content, create tours that are not like this, that forefront a person, that have a strong personal perspective and authentic perspective. And that has grown out of my own experience as a travel writer before I started VoiceMap. After finishing university, I worked for a short time as a journalist at the Daily Telegraph on the travel desk doing travel news. Realized that travel news was actually a terrible way to go out and see the world, and went and ran a pub in the English countryside for a year, saved up a bunch of money, and then traveled from London to Shanghai by land and started one of the first travel blogs with my partner Claire, who I don't know might be listening to this at the moment, so I better include her. We found an audience quite successfully by not doing what I think then became the norm, which was, best of lists, sort of really kind of generic short form content designed to rank on Google. We were doing long form reportage, and very often that was driven by going out and finding interesting people in a destination and hearing from them what they felt about their corner of the world, and then using that as a way of talking about our own experience of the place, and in a sense sort of borrowing ownership of the place from somebody who had strong feelings for it. And so when you then started to write, you could say things like, in that person's words, I remember, I love, I hope, and talk about this person's direct experience of a place. And through that, also, our travels were shaped, and we found that there was much more wonder and much more to remember and to cherish in going into the homes of the people that we met along the way and finding out about their lives than there was in going to the major attractions that were in the guidebooks. And, I think TripAdvisor was starting to be a thing. We're at the top of TripAdvisor lists. And I think that, when I came back and through a kind of a series of coincidences was prompted to start this business, I still had that at the core of what I wanted this to be. And I think now the reason to talk about this now is that actually the kind of all the excuses not to do it have gone away, right? If you don't do this, you just leave so much open ground for AI to take over, and I'll get into that in more detail in a bit. But before we get into what that idea of layering a personal narrative on top of any kind of storytelling, but on audio tours in particular, I think there's already quite an interesting toolkit based on science that comes along with audio tours. And that comes from basically three things, right? The first is that the person's there, right? And I love this idea with GPS triggered audio that where the person is, and you can sort of point to where they should look, and you can really hold them in the palm of your hand. That's a really cool thing, and it really does change how people experience a story. We will provide some references and some links when we post the video so that you can go and look at this in more detail, but science backs this up, essentially. And then you have, on top of this, audio, and audio, I think, is maybe its full potential is maybe not recognized all the time. There was a UCL study that they wired people up to sensors that got body temperature, heart rate, and skin conductance. And I don't think I know what skin conductance is exactly and how that measures emotion, but they had them watch the film Harry Potter and then listen to the audiobook Harry Potter and a number of other familiar stories. The physiological sort of signals indicating that they were engaged, these people, was greater for the audio than for the video. And this is because, you're working a little harder to imagine, and that is a more powerful physiological reaction than just having the image wash over you. So audio is really powerful. And then when you layer a real voice, an authentic voice, a person's voice on top of that, there is an empathetic connection that is created that has been clearly demonstrated. And I think all of us will kind of understand that partly just from listening to tours or listening to podcasts, right? That we become very good at understanding what the tone of voice somebody, what that means, and we're more sensitive to that when it's just audio. When there are other cues, that kind of gets diluted. And then walking amplifies everything, and there are all kinds of studies to say that your brain is much more receptive, much more active when you take a walk than it is when you're sitting in a chair. So we already have the foundations of a really great way of connecting to people. But then when you layer in that personal perspective, you get something really powerful, right? And here I've got, I think, 3 studies just about that some of them overlap, but essentially reinforce this idea. One is that you have, when somebody tells a story, a kind of neural coupling that happens in the person listening to that story. So somebody called Yuri Hansen at Princeton put people in MRI scanners and had one of them tell a story and another listen to that story and saw what was happening in their brains. The person listening to the story had their brain light up in the same places, in the same way as the person telling that story. So the listener and the teller were wired in the same way. And that's not sort of a metaphorical thing. That is like a demonstrable scientific phenomenon that has to do with basically our spatial and our temporal wiring, that we start to then also not just follow, like there's a delay after which our brains light up in the same way as the person telling the story, but we start to anticipate. So our brains actually light up before the person gets to the point in the story where we're trying to anticipate what they're telling us. Then there's another study that was done using blood samples to check the cortisol and oxytocin levels before and after hearing, on the one hand, a personal narrative, and then on the other hand, something neutral. Could be the same story, but one told through a personal perspective and the other told in a very neutral way. And there was no effect from a neutral story, right? When the story was told in a neutral kind of encyclopedic way, there was no effect on these hormones. And these hormones, cortisol is stress, but also attention, right? Stress kind of dictates where we're pointing our attention. Cortisol is empathy, connection, trust. And when a story was told with a strong personal perspective, a strong personal narrative, there was this kind of spike in oxytocin and cortisol. And when those rose together, this person was testing it particularly, in terms of what people would donate to charity. There was a 261% increase in what people were willing to donate to charity. And that's, from a neuroeconomist called Paul Zak. And the little molecule there is the oxytocin molecule, the love molecule, some people call it. Then the pratfall effect, which is my favorite name for a scientific phenomenon in this talk. And this is the idea that, this is demonstrated in multiple studies. There's no sort of one study I can point to, but when a competent person makes a mistake, and in the study that I'm thinking of in particular, competent person spills coffee versus a competent person who doesn't spill coffee, the people, with that person feel a stronger association with the person who spilled the coffee and remember them for a longer time afterwards. And this is obviously because they are now more human to that person, and that fallibility creates a sense of trust, right? And this was used by Domino's in a campaign, I think in 2009, to say that, their pizza wasn't very good, but they were going to try and improve it. And that led to, I think, a 14% increase in sales. And this, I think, is an actual billboard, but, that could be, that might not be true. This is just something I found on the internet. And Helene, who helped me a lot with these slides, provided a really nice example of this from one of our tours. You have Helene there with her sister in Bangkok, doing a tour of Bangkok by Greg Jorgensen, one of our publishers. And I actually, in going through this a few minutes ago, realized that it needs a bit of an edit, but I'm going to read it anyway. But what do I know about urban rejuvenation? Maybe the people who live here would hate that and prefer their street to be quiet and ignored. For this reason and many others, I'm not mayor of Bangkok. And I think it's a nice example of just, not trying to be an expert and kind of, being a little bit fallible. Then on top of that, we have Brene Brown, who I think has become a bit of a pop culture figure. I'd certainly heard of her before. And she spent 15 years researching vulnerability. And her conclusion was that vulnerability is the birthplace of connection. It's the thing that creates trust. And I think that, that should give us license to maybe tell stories that feel a little bit scary, that feel a little bit risky, and to put ourselves into a story when we're not sure that we have a right to be there potentially. But to maybe say that, to be clear about why we're doing it, I guess. So for me, this is we have this medium with these great building blocks for telling a story to a person in a place using audio, and that already is really exciting because you know exactly where they are. It's your voice in their ear. And so it's this last mile that really, I sort of wanted to do this webinar for ages because I think that there's just so much here. Maybe this would be a good time to stop for a few questions, or should I go on? What do you think, Iain?
Well, there aren't any questions from anyone, but yeah, it could be a good place to stop.
Any questions so far, or should I carry on? Nothing, I think.
No, but maybe a question from me.
Okay.
What does this vulnerability mean for a publisher who's telling a story, but they don't necessarily bring themselves in the stories that they usually tell? Like if you are somebody who never brings your own personality into a story, how do you actually?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends why they aren't, right? If it's because they don't think they have anything interesting to say, then probably being vulnerable is putting out there what they think is interesting to say, or what is interesting to them, and risking that maybe not being interesting to other people. I think that people really enjoy that on the tours, right? There are curmudgeons, and the curmudgeons I think tend to be quite noisy, who will review a tour and say that there was too much about this person and not enough information, and they wanted more information about this or more information about that. But by and large, people respond well to these personal anecdotes, to more information about the person whose voice is in their ear. And I think as VoiceMap grows and the platform progresses, a lot of people are looking at selling more than just the one tour that they've published, right? And that personal connection is a great way of having people choose not just another tour, but your tour as the tour that they do next, whether they're locals looking for a number of tours to do in the same city, or people who are trying to fill a few days, right? If they connect to you personally in some way, they're much more likely to do your tour instead of just another generic tour that they're not sure who has published that.
There's a question from Elodie in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
But before I get to that, Becky's saying vulnerability isn't just about personality. Maybe just speaking in your own accent could be vulnerable, which I think is quite interesting. Elodie is asking about using AI, not just to help with scripts, but with translation. Should we pin that for a little bit later?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, the translation is sort of on the next slide anyway. So I'll go over to that. So, okay, so the next kind of group of slides is about how AI gets used practically, right? And what can't it do systematically, what it's going to get better at. So I have personally just been blown away by the improvement. I use Claude a lot, and the amount that has improved in the last year has been incredible. I think, it's going to get more polished, more fluent. It's going to do a better and better job of removing hallucinations. It will always hallucinate. It will never be as good as a true expert. But, in pulling together and synthesizing information, in going out and doing a volume of research in a matter of minutes that would take an actual human days and days, potentially weeks and months to do, AI is incredible and only getting better. Its multilingual capacity has quickly outstripped anything else, right? If you look at Google Translate, which we've used extensively at VoiceMap, not so much for script translation, but for customer support, right? Because we have tours in multiple languages, and so we have to deal with customers in multiple languages. And without having people who speak those languages on the team, our best option for a long time was Google Translate. But pretty much all of the LLMs now do a much better job of translation. And some of that comes down to how you prompt the LLM. And if you wanted to translate in a way that retains some of the author's kind of idiom, I guess, some of their authenticity, some of their way of speaking, there's obviously nothing better than a professional translator. But the speed and cost of doing it using AI is pretty tempting. So, and that's inevitably going to improve, I think, and the cost is probably going to come down until maybe it doesn't come down anymore because the bubble pops and these companies actually have to figure out how to make money from these data centers that they're running at a huge loss at the moment. But who knows when that actually is going to happen. So that kind of leaves you looking at, well, what is it that AI can't do, and how do you apply that to an audio tour? I think the first thing to say is AI isn't actually in the world. It's not there inhabiting the space. AI has no idea what it's like to get lost. It has no real ability to understand how space is put together. An LLM is not good at understanding a map, for instance. It's not even good at sort of tracing a floor plan for a house. And there are out there pure AI audio tour apps that give you the option of a few parameters and then generate a tour for you. And one of the examples I'm thinking of was by somebody who is an acquaintance of mine, a colleague. If we see each other at a conference, we'll have a drink, and I asked him to demo this to me and to do it for Cape Town, and the tour that he generated was not good. So, and then that wasn't because the content was terrible, but because it took you to places in a sequence that didn't make any sense, and with long spaces between them that were empty, and it just didn't really know how to put space together because it doesn't exist in space. And if you look at where things are moving, I'm trying to remember the name of the AI researcher who recently left Meta. Yann LeCun, I think is his name. And he said he believes that LLMs are a dead end, that they won't actually lead us to true sort of artificial general intelligence. And he's now working on what's called a world model, where you actually do try and get AI to inhabit physical space so that it can learn in the same way that a human learns, by being in a body. But that's something for the future. I think that right now we're primarily looking at LLMs. And so if you think about what you can do by, engaging physically with the world, you're already ahead of an LLM, and that's unlikely to change. And then, the stylistic range available to AI, and here, Rosalia is kind of a great example, because she did something by combining all of these languages and genres into this incredible album that AI could not do, right? And And so I'm going to borrow from an American science fiction writer called Ted Chiang here, who said, art requires the accumulation of choices. A 10,000 word short story requires something in the range of 10,000 choices. But if you're prompting AI, you're actually making very few choices, right? A good prompt will try and give as much context as possible so that there are a large number of choices, but it's still never like the whole idea is the input is smaller than the output. That's the whole sort of promise of AI. If you sit down and you actually do the work, you are going to arrive at a wider range of conclusions than AI ever would. So, and there was a study on this where they basically got a whole bunch of people to prompt, and they realized that through prompting, the range of outputs was all really similar, even though nobody else was kind of in contact through this prompting. The mere filter of AI reduced everything to being quite similar. So, if you take those two things, it basically says, use space in interesting ways, use the fact that you're in the world in interesting ways, and, start from the blank page sometimes, and start from your own perspective, I think. And then to sort of get more practical and talk about the steps of producing an audio tour and where AI can help out there. I mean, we've just talked about AI not being spatially aware. So if you ask it to suggest what your tour should include, it's not going to do a good job of that. But I think it is a really useful research assistant in figuring out where you might have some gaps in going beyond, the most surface level sources. So finding actual quotes, finding interesting historical details, local stories, obscure stuff that you're not going to get on the first page of Google, as a thinking partner to help you sort of refine the outline. And something that I think when there is silence or long stretches of silence and people aren't sure what to say, often the best thing to do is to go into the background of a wider area, be it of the neighborhood, of the city, of the country. And I think AI is very good if you're looking at trying to find more general context and fill up some space with that kind of contextual stuff. But still, this is the part, I think, if you don't really want to map your own tour, you don't want to get onto the ground, go wandering about, look at some interesting details, try and figure out what it's all about, then probably, it's not worth publishing a tour. The script, for me, as a writer, the script is really a strong expression of my personality, but I recognize that not everybody is a writer and that AI can make a really useful writing partner. And I think there you want a script that still sounds like there's a human on the other side of it, right? Sometimes AI content really does feel like there's no there, if that makes sense. Like it sounds, it's sort of calorieless, it's nutritionless information. You kind of are stuck it in by the fact that it sounds and imitates a human really well, and you suddenly realize that it's kind of something's missing, right? There's an ingredient missing. So you can actually, use AI to help you with that, I think, instead of the other way around. I use Claude, and I think Claude projects are fantastic for this kind of thing. So if you were to set up a Claude project and give it your route outline, give it your research as project files, add some of the stuff from VoiceMap's documentation, including the guidelines that we've used for the ingredients of a perfect tour, and then give it really clear project instructions saying that it's going to be spoken, not read on a page, that you really want to make it as authentic and intimate as possible, and that you want a tour that feels, by the end of it, larger than the sum of its parts, it will do a decent job of helping you get there and reminding you when you aren't taking opportunities that might be right in front of you. Claude can also, learn a style. You can add a style that, I have my style as an option that I can use to generate text, and that's based on feeding it a large number of examples of my own writing. You could even record yourself speaking and then get Claude to kind of learn what that looks like, to help, if you are going to generate a piece of writing, then, generate it with as much context as possible. And then in recording, right, I think by recording, we mean the entire audio production process. There is no substitute for a real human voice. And that doesn't mean a professional voice. That just means a person that often, doesn't sound perfect. And in some ways, we maybe do too good a job of editing our publisher's audio to remove all of the mistakes that make them sound more human. One of the most troubling things we've seen is that when a publisher's voice doesn't come across immediately as really human, people think, this is AI, I've been tricked, and they negatively respond to the tour. They leave a negative review because they think that the tour is AI, which is kind of, we want people to respond to AI that way, but it's having the effect of making people suspicious of genuine voices because they worry that they're kind of being tricked into consuming AI content. So there, I guess the vulnerability thing comes in, right? That you maybe are not aiming for polish in the voiceover. You're aiming for something that really conveys how you feel and conveys authenticity and emotion, which is a bit of a different brief to sounding like a professional voiceover artist. This is a lot more difficult, and we have an increasing number of requests to use AI voices from publishers whose first language isn't English. I get it, where the accent kind of gets in the way of something being easily understood. There is a good case for it, but there are tools, 11 Labs, fish.audio, where you could potentially train the AI on your voice speaking your mother tongue, and then have it read the script in a voice that is your own, but it's an AI voice, but it at least sounds similar to you. And we've had some success with publishers who we've got voiceover from them in English. We've helped them translate their tours, and then we've trained AI on their voice and used that for the translations, and it works quite well. I imagine there are quite a few questions now, Eileen, about the more practical stuff.
Yes, there are. We have a few in the chat. I can read a couple for you that I think are quite interesting. One from Irma is, can you use the fact that you're not using AI for speech as a unique selling point?
I don't know if it's necessary directly. Certainly, we are going to be very consciously talking about VoiceMap as something that is at its root very human, and making sure that we clearly differentiate the brand from AI generated content. And so, I think actually the next slide, this sort of anticipates the next slide, where we'll talk about how publisher profiles are changing. But I think it's not so much about consciously not saying I'm not AI, as it is about doing things in a way that an AI just couldn't.
I Just conscious of our time.
Yeah, any other questions?
There are a couple of suggestions of what publishers are saying, how they are using AI. Becky has a good idea way that she's using it for research, as well as Heidi. I want to one question from James is, what about customers using AI like ChatGPT to find out things to do in a location? How do we ensure that VoiceMap tours pop up prominently?
Okay, well, that's also the next slide, right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so next slide, where AI helps with distribution, right? There are a lot of ways of talking about this, and there are a lot of ways of using AI for distribution. I'm going to focus on one thing in particular because I think it kind of gets to the heart of it, and it ultimately, Google is still the kind of foundation of all of this. Essentially, when OpenAI, ChatGPT, or Anthropic, Claude perform a search, they're basically using Google, right? So Google's rankings are still the kind of foundation upon which discovery through AI rests. But this has evolved over the last few years, and SEO has basically changed from something where there was keyword density and then links, right? So Google would look and see, well, this has definitely got the keywords, and some of those keywords are in headings, and there are a whole bunch of people who link to this particular page or to this website, and that indicates to us that it is a reliable source, it's authoritative, and so we'll rank this highly. But with machine learning initially, and now what we're all calling AI, that's evolved, and it's now done using what's referred to as a knowledge graph. And that knowledge graph tries to understand things in a way a bit more like a human would, and to look for signals according to its EEAT framework. That is clumsy because it used to just be EAT, which stood for expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. But in 2002, with the advent of LLMs, Google put at the beginning as the second E, experience, right? Because it realized that it was going to be very easy for LLMs to generate content that sounded like it matched the tests for expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness, but it again had never experienced any of this. And so it added that as a criteria to its framework. And we now have just in the last week or so updated all of the publisher profiles to use that framework extensively. This is live. We are working on some examples to share before we really start pushing everybody to update their profiles. But you're welcome to go and do that. I think Helene is going to drop the documentation for that into the comments right now. But our new profiles use a lot of structured data, so that's invisible and only visible to Google. But do that to feed information into the knowledge graph, and that information that is being fed into the knowledge graph is around EEAT, right? And here we really are leaning into, it's not about an academic qualification necessarily, or about, a CV or some sort of credential that you might or might not have. It's also about being passionate about your subject, about being a local potentially, about, somebody who has experience that speaks very directly to the subject matter of your tours. And so a lot of the fields are strings, as in you can enter It's not drop-down lists. It's not check boxes or radio buttons. It's text you can enter, and that allows for a reasonable amount of flexibility. So the new profiles, they have overall rating counts and average ratings across all of your tours, as well as the total number of tours. They have a tagline, and I encourage you to, add something that don't be scared to sell yourself in your tagline. It might feel a little awkward, but people need to trust that your tours are by somebody that's going to provide a worthwhile perspective. A location, in the example on the screen, I've just put Cape Town, but that is also text. It's a string, so I could say, Cape Town after many years in Asia, or something to that effect. You can have something a bit more complicated than just the name of a place. And then we've added to the number of links that you can choose to include in your profile. You can add Wikipedia, Patreon. There's always been an Amazon author page. There's now a direct link to your podcast, and TripAdvisor is there. That's not new, but that's on top of all of the standard stuff like your website and all of your social media accounts. And if anybody has ideas about other links that might demonstrate their authoritativeness, let us know. And then space for a bio that is, has a bit of depth. And I think that this is really important, that because it's quite a job publishing a tour, especially your first one, that when your editor says, oh, and I also need you to write a bio, people kind of write a few lines and that's that, because they're dying to publish this thing. But that bio is really important. And when it's short, Google doesn't actually even index your profile page. So it's looking for enough content to say that this has unique and interesting information about this person. So we'll include it in the Google index. If it's under 150 words, there's a good chance that Google isn't even going to include it in its search results. So you want a bio that has some substance. And then we've created space to add a list of credentials. I'm nearly done. I've got Helene over there. And that's under the headings: awards, publications and shows, education, certifications, professional associations, and achievements. And these all help to send a signal that your tours are grounded in experience and expertise and authoritativeness. And I think this speaks to the changing nature of authorship and authority, that, I think I used that as my post for LinkedIn. In a world where expertise can be easily generated, what is authority? And I think that authority now is increasingly coming from being human and being weirdly human, right? At the beginning, I said that AI-generated content felt to everybody like it was weirdly human. But I think what we want now is to lean into the fact that humans are weird, and that when we tell a story, it should be weirdly human, instead of, imitating a human. And because I'm a bit of a Rosalia fan, I'm going to end with a quote from her, which is, the more dopamine, the more I want the opposite. And I think that that's something that VoiceMap as a whole can really give to people, is periods of time when you are really sort of immersed in your surroundings and paying attention in a way that you don't in your everyday life. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Next slide says questions.